Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Trusted Trustee podcast. And as usual, I'm joined by Tracey, besters in the Southern Highlands. How are you, Tracey? It is great to see you today.
Good afternoon, Darin. I'm really well, and the Southern Highlands is putting on its 4 seasons in one day today again. So, life is good.
Wow. Yeah, not much of a summer. Well, certainly not in Sydney. I can't speak for the Southern Highlands, but it's not been great here. But not too bad today.
Good.
And anyway, this podcast is brought to you by Super Fund Property Valuations, ATO compliance in a click. If your SMSF accountant or auditor is on your back for a property valuation, just order an affordable report from the experts with ease using the details you can see on the screen now, or go to superfundpropertyvaluations.com.au. And I know I say this every time, but I can't stress it enough that valuations are so important and certainly an area of focus for the ATO and hence auditors as well. And of course, will be as well, particularly if the Treasurer can push through that horrible Division 296 tax. But as we speak, he has had no success in the upper house of getting it through. We keep our fingers crossed that that will continue to be the case and it will become a moot point once we go to the polling booths a little bit later this year. But we're not here to talk about Division 296 tax.
Yeah.
We're actually going to talk about something more positive today and something that a lot of people would like to use their self-managed super fund, if they could, to facilitate their later in life sea change. Isn't that right, Tracey? So basically what we're talking about here is purchasing a residential property in your fund and then hopefully moving into that property later when you're ready for your retirement and your sea change, if you want to call it that, downsizing into a different home if you're an empty nester, but for those years when you've stopped working. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and it's a very well sought after strategy, isn't it, Trace?
Yeah, look, it is, Darin, and I think if you search superfund and property, then the list of things and the list of questions that come up on forums in particular is endless almost. And certainly is a lot of interest and a lot of question around, can you have a property in your self-managed super fund that you move into later on? Is that a possibility at all? And if so, what would you need to take into consideration? And if not, well, what are the options available to you? So it is a popular conversation piece, Darin, and certainly a question that I've been asked over the last, 20 odd years around, this whole concept of sea change and tree change. And it doesn't have to be sea change or tree change. It could be street change or suburb change or state change. It could be any of those things. But the whole concept is, I've got a property in my super fund. Can I live in it when I retire? So that's, it's interesting conversation that we're going to have in the next half an hour. So
Yeah, basically insert word change is the strategy
yeah,
that we're talking about. And
exactly.
the first thing probably that we should cover off is, again, there are sole purpose implications here. I know the ATO has been a little bit finicky about communicating what your intentions are with issues like this or with strategies like this, as in you can't really communicate, or you shouldn't communicate, that I'm getting this property trace because basically that's going to be my sea change thing. Because I kid you not, this has been raised in webinars before, that the ATO or somebody might question, if that's on the record, that they might question, well, hang on, so you're not purchasing this property for your retirement savings needs. You're purchasing this property as a scheme. I use that word because that's the one that they pick up on, to provide a property for you to move into when you retire. That's a really important point, isn't it, Trace? That whole sole purpose
Yeah.
consideration.
It really is, Darin. And, it kind of is the overarching concept and the overarching thing of anything that we talk about on this podcast and any of the education that I do in the industry is around, everything has to still come back and meet that sole purpose test. So remember, the sole purpose test is that everything that you do, all of the investment decisions that you make within the self-managed super fund as a trustee is for the sole purpose of providing retirement benefits to the members. So if you were going to buy a property that had zero income and very little prospects of capital growth, but the reason that you bought the property is because I like the area and I want to move into it later on, that might not meet the sole purpose test. Now, interesting point about that though, and I'm not saying that you can do it. I'm just saying the interesting point from a discussion purpose about that is if it was for your retirement, is that providing for your retirement if you've secured that property now? There's two ways of looking at it, I guess. But the overarching thing is please make sure that in any property decision or any investment decision that you're looking at in the self-managed super fund space, you've still got that sole purpose kind of, thing in the back of your head. It's always got to meet the sole purpose test.
Yeah, really important. Again, boils down to just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it.
Exactly.
And that's often the overriding point when you're looking at some strategies to do with your SMSF. But that out of the way, because that's probably
Yep.
the most important thing to consider before we even start to have this discussion.
Yeah.
Look, how do you go about it then, Tracey?
Yeah, so let's say that we've got a self-managed super fund, we have property in that self-managed super fund, and rather than sell that property when we get to retirement, we've decided that, well, I kind of like this property. I like the area that it's invested into or where the property is, and I really want to just move into that property as opposed to selling it. I don't want to pay agents' fees. I don't want to, I don't want to risk the market. I want to actually move into it. Well, the short answer is that whilst the self-managed super fund owns the property, if it's a residential property which you would be able to live in, you can't live in it whilst the super fund owns it. So we have to do something with that property. We can't just move into it. It's unlike commercial property or business real property that we've been talking about in the last podcast, where you can actually use the property yourself. If it's business real property, you can. If it's a residential property, you can't. You can't actually live in that property yourself. And it kind of, it's a bizarre concept really, because if you put your hats on and you've got your, your member hat and your trustee hat, and you're like, well, wait a second, it's all me. Like it's, it's my property, it's my super fund. And yeah, I get it. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense from that perspective. But we have to come back to the concessional tax considerations. And, the self-managed super fund is a separate legal entity, separate from you in all way, shape, and form. And you have those dual roles. So you can't just live in a property that you own indirectly via the self-managed super fund. So that's the first hurdle, I guess. We have to do something with this property. So the options are, I guess, Darin, is, at some point in time, you could buy the property from your self-managed super fund. So you could do an actual conveyancing transaction where the property is sold to yourself. And that's, quite a straightforward process. But there is this little thing called stamp duty, or not quite such a little thing anymore with the value of property. So we've got to take that into consideration. Or you could talk about maybe doing an in-specie transfer.
Yeah, really important. I mean, the key consideration there is that the property actually has to exit the SMSF
Yeah.
before you can enjoy it for your retirement purposes or your sea change or insert word change strategy that you're going to use. But there are all sorts of other tax considerations. We're not going to talk about stamp duty today because the beautiful way stamp duty is constructed in this country is that it's different in every state, and we don't have enough time to cover all of the states and territories individually. Just be aware that the stamp duty laws need to be adhered to, and they are different in every state. Is probably the best summation that we can provide. But there are other tax considerations here, aren't there, Tracey?
Yes, there are, Darin. And, just to add one last comment to the stamp duty situation is that in some states, there may be an exemption of stamp duty if you were to do that in specie transfer out of the super fund into your own name. So hopefully your property is in the states that allow that. But please make sure you get the right legal advice on stamp duty. And the other tax that we have to take into consideration, Darin, is our capital gains tax. So anytime a self-managed super fund sells an asset, whatever type of asset that is, except for cash, there is a trigger of capital gains tax. So if we're going to sell our property to ourselves, then we have to think about two things, two main things. One is the capital gains tax, but the other side of it is the consideration. Because if I sell an asset to you, Darin, I'm pretty sure you want some cash for that, like, you know, or I want some cash for that. So there's that consideration of cash going back in. So how are you going to fund that particular transaction, as opposed to the in specie side of the equation, which is where I transfer the property from my super fund to myself, and I'm not putting any cash back into the super fund. I'm actually, you know, that is the sole part of the transaction, is that in specie transfer. That's still going to potentially trigger capital gains tax. Now, the capital gains tax is going to depend on whether the super fund is in retirement phase or accumulation phase. So that's the first part of that equation. But there's always a but with this bit. But for us to do an in specie transfer, we can't have that asset in pension phase or retirement phase.
Okay.
Because we can't make an in specie pension payment. We've got to make our pension payments, if we're in retirement phase, if we go back, I don't know how many podcasts ago, where we were talking about liquidity and making pension payments. One of the things we talked about is that a pension payment has to be in cash. Yeah. So when it comes to the capital gains tax side of things, of an in specie transfer of our insert change property, we do need to really, really carefully look at what the capital gains tax implications are, because it is likely that there is going to be an element of capital gains tax payable, purely because we can't have that transfer of that property treated as a pension payment. So if we've got a self-managed super fund which has got, you know, one property in it, for example, then we've got to really think about capital gains tax and the liquidity in order to be able to pay that capital gains tax when it becomes due and payable on the lodgement of our super fund tax return.
So does that mean that the property has to be rolled back into accumulation phase in order to complete the transaction, or actually execute the transaction?
Potentially, yes, Darin. In the example, if you've only got one property in the super fund, and let's say you're in retirement phase now, if you wanted to do an in specie transfer of that property out of the super fund, yes, you would have to do that partial commutation or full commutation of your retirement phase, flip it back over into accumulation phase, and then it's a lump sum withdrawal. So that the transfer in specie comes out of the lump sum withdrawal elements. So that also means that we have to have met, in order to be able to do any withdrawal out of super, we've still got to meet the requirements to be able to withdraw. Preservation age and condition of release. So we're talking about if we're already in retirement phase now, but let's say if we were in accumulation phase to start with, we hadn't yet commenced a retirement phase income stream, we still have to go through all of those steps in order to be able to access that property as a transfer in specie. So yes, we'd have to go back to accumulation phase, which means that we change our tax situation in the self-managed super fund to start with, and then that transfer of the in specie property happens after that. So we're no longer fully in retirement phase. We're actually, you know, maybe part, or we're in full accumulation phase. So it just depends on the, you know, other assets of the self-managed super fund. It depends on those circumstances. But we do need to make sure that we have factored in the capital gains tax situation, because that catches people unaware. You know, they think I'm in retirement phase, therefore there's no tax. But unfortunately, that's not always the case.
It's actually a really good point, Tracey, because I think people can get tripped up by that, by the attraction of everything being in retirement phase, and oh, it's all tax free, and that's fantastic. What do you mean I've got to consider CGT? But I think the other thing to highlight here is also the need to think ahead with these things. So if this is your intention to purchase a property with the future in mind as to potentially living in it at some point in time, I suppose you've really got to consider, well, should I ever really include that property in as a pension asset to start with?
Mm.
Because I mean, I know individual situations are different, and maybe you don't have that many assets to be able to fund a pension, so you need to do it. But it would seem a little bit counterproductive in some ways to put the property to support a pension only to have to roll it back out um, for you to complete the final stages of that strategy.
Yeah.
People should think about that, shouldn't they?
Yeah, definitely, Darren. And I think that this is not, this doesn't necessarily come up as a, if you set up a self-managed super fund in your 40s or 50s, perhaps, you've got this kind of thought process around, well, maybe I've got a property that I might want to buy at some point in time in the future that I might want to move into. Like it's all mights and maybes and, what ifs. If you set up a self-managed super fund and, quite a lot of cohort of our self-managed super fund members now are in kind of their 30s and early 40s, so
Mhm.
they're not necessarily thinking about what am I going to do in 35 or 40 years time in terms of a specific investment or specific asset. That doesn't come up very often in my experience. So I think it's more around, yes, plan ahead, but it's about understanding what is possible. It's about understanding what are the rules, what are the regulations. If I've got a property, if, hypothetically speaking, if I have a property in my self-managed super fund at the time that I retire or am looking at retirement, then what can I do with that property? Can I live in it? Can I transfer it to myself? What can I do? And it's the same, I guess, with any of the assets because, what if you've got a property, and we talked about this as well. What if we've got a property that, isn't getting enough rental income, and so therefore we've got liquidity issues. I had a client call me just 2 days ago saying I've got some liquidity issues going on, a new client of mine, because he's got very, very high asset values in the super fund, but they're getting very low rent. So he's now got this decision to make about, well, what does he do? How can he manage those liquidity issues that we talked about in a few podcasts ago? So yes, plan ahead, but also before even thinking specifically, it's about understanding. It's about that empowerment of knowledge and that education, which is, part of what this podcast is all about, is to try and educate people and, empower them to be able to make better decisions for themselves. So planning is really important. And I think it's just about understanding. I was reading a question on a forum just the other day, Darin, and someone had said that they had set up a self-managed super fund and they bought their first property, but they didn't know what they could do with it at retirement. And there was a lot of comments that were fairly judgmental in a way, because they said, oh, you shouldn't have set up the super fund if you didn't think about this. Well, we're all on a different journey and we all have different understandings and different backgrounds. So I don't want to be so crass as to say, well, you shouldn't have set it up if you didn't think about it, because I think that's being a little too harsh. But certainly if you're going to invest in something, you've got to plan for the exit. You've got to think about and understand, what does it look like from an exit perspective? And this is part of that conversation.
That is extremely harsh commentary, as
Yeah.
you no doubt noted there, because you know, it could be, and by the sounds of it, the individuals in question are not really near retirement. So if you purchase an asset, then of course retirement's so far in the future.
Mhm.
Why would you know what you were going to do with it? I mean, I'm sure that, again, planning with the exit in mind, you should have an idea of potentially what you're going to do to it or
Yeah.
do with it. But why would you know the details of it? I mean, we can't predict everything. And that isn't a particularly harsh thing to say, considering how much change goes through the legislation with superannuation.
Yeah.
One thing that you thought, I mean, look at the Div 296 tax. Would you have thought that, oh, yeah, I wanted to buy a property, but that'll push me over $3 million in my total super balance. Should I do that anymore? So any
Mhm.
plan, or you might have already done it and then might be thinking, well, what do I do now? You
Yeah.
can't turn around and then say, well, you should have thought about it at the time that you established your fund. Well, I didn't know about that at the time I established my fund. So that's
Yeah.
particularly harsh. I
It was
think,
harsh. It was harsh. And I
Tracy.
think that, Darin, we as much as we can plan and even exit planning, exit planning is crucial. And I, don't have any clients that I've spoken to over the last 25 years that I haven't spoken to about exit planning, because it's really important to at least have an understanding about what you want to do on the exit of the SMSF. Even if it's not set in concrete. It's not like you're signing with blood and you can never change your mind again. Like, come on, I'm a woman. I'm going to change my mind probably 60 times between now and when I retire. My husband's probably going to laugh when he listens to this podcast about that. But anyways, it's not set in concrete. It's not set in stone, but it's good to have an understanding. And I think having an understanding is the most important part.
Yep, absolutely, Tracy. Now, speaking of understanding, there are some other nuances with this strategy that people need to consider. Probably
Mm.
things that you wouldn't think of off the top of your head, in particular with funds. I mean, if I could be stereotypical here, with funds, say, where mum and dad are the trustees and the members of the fund. With this
Yeah.
strategy, there are certain things that you have to think about there, aren't there, Tracy?
Yeah, there are, Darin. And the crucial one, I think, or the one that I'd like to talk about with you now is about having an adequate member balance. So let's say that we've got mum and dad in a fund, we've got a property, we've got some cash, maybe we've got some shares, but the property is the predominant asset. It's like, the lion's share of the SMSF, which is a pretty common SMSF really these days, particularly with the way property prices have increased over the last 5 years. But let's say that we've got that. And if we've got mum and dad who are pretty much the same age and are pretty much going to retire at the same point in time, we may not have the issue that I'm about to mention. But if we've got different ages, and so one member is going to actually reach that preservation age of 60 and condition of release sooner than the other person, then we may not be able to do that in specie transfer of property. The reason I say that is because if the property was, or the account balances are split 50-50 per se, they're 50-50, then one member, the oldest member, or the one who's going to meet condition of release first, may not have an adequate account balance in order to be able to satisfy the in specie transfer or the lump sum payment of that property in its entirety. So that's a pretty big consideration when it comes down to the practical, outlay of this insert change property strategy. We've got to have adequate member balance in order to be able to transfer the property out, because I'm not quite sure how we're going to transfer, say, 60% of the property out and live in it when the 40% is still owned by the super fund. That might be a problem.
Yeah, that's huge. Like, how do people get around that? If they have to
Well,
address it, how do you actually get around something like that?
yeah, so you wouldn't be able to, as long as the super fund has an equity share of that property. So you could potentially, I shouldn't say can as in a definite, you could potentially transfer a part of the property out, depending on stamp duty considerations and the legal ramifications of that. But you certainly couldn't live in the property because as long as the super fund has an equity ownership, whether that's 1% or 100%, we're still bound by those same rules sitting under the superannuation legislation and regulations. So the whole concept of an in specie transfer in that situation most likely wouldn't be possible. Now, there might be other circumstances that, could come into play that make it possible, but at face value, it wouldn't be. So then you come back to, well, can I sell the property to myself? And then how do I fund that sale? Can I do a non-concessional contribution back into the fund in order to be able to satisfy that sale? What can I, how can I, what can I do? How do I get consideration in? Is there other assets that I can, so can I boost the cash of the SMSF to pay me out a lump sum withdrawal in cash that gives me money? What can I do? How do I, get money into the fund or money to me in order to be able to satisfy this transaction itself? How can I boost my member balance so I can, satisfy that entirety of the property? So there's a couple of considerations in that regard. And the other thing that I think from a consideration perspective, Darin, as well, is is really just around segregation of investment strategies. Because if we have most funds, like I don't know what the statistical stats on this is, but most funds are running an unsegregated or proportional investment strategy. So they're not saying that this particular asset belongs to a particular member,
Yes.
but that would be another issue, another massive hurdle to meet if you had your property segregated to a particular member. Because if it's segregated to the member that's not meeting condition of release, then we can't transfer that out anyway. You'd have to redo your whole investment strategy. So there's a couple of like just practical things around that strategy of transferring the property out that is important.
Yeah, multiple investment strategies can be a little bit tricky. And then, of
Yeah.
course, when you get to a situation like this, it adds another layer of complexity as to how you make it conform to the guidelines you put down in the investment strategy. And does it suit? Because if it doesn't, then that's a whole nother road that you're going to have to go down and address.
Yeah.
I'm not the technician, obviously, in this chat, Tracy. You are. I might be about to ask a really dumb question, but can you split the purchase of the property between the two
So
members?
when you actually when you buy the property to start with, or when
Or
you
when you
sell it back
exit
to
it, when
yourself,
you exit it, yeah.
when you entered it?
When you exit it.
Exit.
Yeah.
So comes back to, yes, potentially, Darin, but it comes back to my comment that even if the super fund, like if you've split it, say, 60-40, and both members can meet condition of release and you can transfer the property out, so 60% goes here and 40% goes
Yeah.
there, that is a possibility. But stamp duty then is the crucial part of that. So if you're in a state where there was a stamp duty exemption on the transfer out, you would really need to seek that specialist legal advice to make sure that you could still get that exemption. Because otherwise, if you can't get the exemption, then you're paying stamp duty at current market values, which might be prohibitive from a tax or from a cash flow perspective and a liquidity
Yeah.
perspective. So at face value, yes, my opinion is yes, you could split it, but it really comes then down to what are the other factors to take in, and stamp duty is the most important other factor outside of the SMSF, because it's not the SMSF that pays the stamp duty, of course. It's going to be the individual members that would have to foot the stamp duty if they had to pay stamp duty to get the property out. And in most states, that's the case anyway. There is a stamp duty element. So that being the case, if you could do 60-40 and the whole property comes out of the super fund, then you can do what you want with the property outside of super. But if it's still a super fund involvement somewhere, then we still have our restrictions as if the super fund owned all of the property.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Just a couple of things. We weren't going to talk about stamp duty, and we've actually talked about stamp duty quite a bit. Not going into a lot of detail, obviously, but it does actually highlight the importance that element will play in any of these types of strategies, even though we obviously don't know how it will play out in the particular state in which you're living or where the property might be held. But obviously very important. And of course, the other thing that you've highlighted there, if the SMSF continues to hold a stake in the property, well, you can't do your strategy. You can't complete the strategy.
Exactly.
And that would, well, you might be able to obviously get to your ultimate goal a little bit later on. But if you're ready to pull the trigger now, doesn't that kind of defeat the purpose a little bit?
It really does. And I think it comes, and this is where it comes down to, well, what's the purpose of buying the property in the first place? And if your purpose of buying the property was purely an investment purpose, sole purpose aside, I'm not talking about sole purpose, but, practical, you're buying the property just for investment. And then later on you go, oh, actually, I wouldn't mind having ownership of that property myself. Then, that's different to investing in a property with that, long-term vision. So you kind of can plan a little bit differently around how do you fund the property, and do you actually segregate that into a particular member's, hands, or into their member account, as opposed to having it in a proportional method. So there's lots of considerations, Darin, around this kind of insert change property. But and just because you can do it, I'm not proposing that you should do it. But it's really important to educate people on the ramifications of having the property in the super fund and wanting to live in it, and what do you need to take into consideration for that to be a scenario.
Yeah, it's again one of these things where the complexity of the whole thing, it might appear simple on the surface, but anybody who listens to our podcast will know that there is nothing simple about any of these strategies. In previous podcasts, even getting money in and out of super is not as easy as just maybe making an electronic transfer to yourself or anything like that, or to the fund. Everything is complex and all of the rules are intertwined. And this, as you can see, is no different.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But in saying all of that, Darin, I have had very clients that have done this particular strategy around, making a decision at some point after the property was inside of the super fund that's, really they would like to retain this ownership long term. And we've successfully been able to help them, understand all of the rules in the super fund. And they have actually been able to do that in specie transfer to themselves and live in the property, once they've met retirement, and what they've done with the property after that, is outside of the SMSF space. So they can, it's just like a normal property that they own. So it is certainly possible, but you've just got to make sure you take into consideration all of the things we talked about today and more, depending on the individual circumstances of the SMSF and the individuals.
Well, that's actually absolutely brilliant, Tracey, because you've demonstrated that there are real life examples where you can implement this strategy and it can pay off and everybody's happy at the end. And that's what we want, is the right outcome to eventuate, so that people are happy with what they get. And I think that's a really nice, positive note, upbeat note to finish on today, because guess what? We've run out of time again. So
That's surprising, Darin.
yeah, it is, isn't it? Really surprising. So, again, thank you, Tracey, for joining me for another episode of the Trusted Trustee podcast.
Thank you, Darin. It's my pleasure. And I'm looking forward in the next episode to having a little bit of a chat, maybe about some property developments inside of SMSF. What do you reckon?
Yeah, very contentious.
Should we do
Very
that one?
contentious issue, that, and certainly one that's raised a lot of questions in my whole time actually covering this sector. That has been a constant question popping up as to, oh, can I do this inside an SMSF? So very important and very popular question to find out whether or not you can do that within an SMSF. But yep, something to look forward to there. Thanks again, Tracey. Thank you to my team for putting this production together. Most importantly, thank you to all of you who are listening out there or watching this podcast out there. Your support is very valuable to us. And don't forget, if you're enjoying our content on YouTube, please remember to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and please listen to the end, because that helps our stats out too. Other than that, we look forward to presenting the next podcast to you, and we hope that you will join us then. Other than that, travel safely, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks very much. See you next time.